My blood turned to ice the moment I heard my sister say, "If she crashes again, don't bring her back until after the wire clears." The ICU smelled like antiseptic and warm plastic, and even with my eyes shut I could feel the fluorescent light pressing through my eyelids in a thin white burn. The sheets under my hands were stiff and overlaundered. The tape on my wrist tugged every time my pulse jumped against the 4-line. Somewhere to my left, a monitor kept up its calm electronic beeping, far too polite for what was happening 3 feet away from me. "Vanessa," a man's voice said sharply. "Dr. Colin Mercer." I knew it from the pre-op consult. Controlled. Alarmed. My mother didn't even lower her voice. She signed the directive. "She's had 1 code event already. We're not doing this again. Not for a prolonged resuscitation." Leather soles shifted on polished vinyl. My stepfather, Richard Vale, pacing in those short, irritated bursts he always did when he wanted other people to mistake agitation for authority. A clipboard snapped shut. A nurse inhaled through her nose. My sister's bracelets gave a soft silver chime as she crossed her arms. Then Vanessa spoke again, lower this time, thinking I was too sedated to understand. "Tomorrow morning at 9 the acquisition funds hit. If she's still alive, the voting shares stay locked with her." The air left my lungs, so hard my ribs ached under the blanket. I couldn't move, couldn't open my eyes, couldn't do anything except lie there and listen while my family discussed my death like a scheduling issue. My name is Elena Marlowe. I'm 37, and this is a story of how I listened to my own family try to decide whether I deserved another heartbeat, and how I used that moment to dismantle every lie they had built around me. At first all I could do was catalog details, because panic is useless when your body won't obey you. My mother, Judith Marlowe, wore a perfume that always smelled like powder and cold roses. Vanessa's heels struck the floor in a steady rhythm, like a metronome counting down to something ugly. Richard cleared his throat before every lie, a small dry rasp that had become so familiar to me over the years I could have found him in a crowd blindfolded. And Nurse Tessa Ruiz, the night-charge nurse I'd met before surgery, had a habit of resting 2 fingers against the medication cart when she was trying not to interrupt someone she absolutely intended to stop. "Mrs. Marlowe," Tessa said, and there was steel under her softness now, "the patient is currently listed as full code." "Because that chart hasn't been updated," my mother snapped. I heard paper being lifted. "Here, her directive." There was a pause. Not long. Long enough. "Where did this come from?" Dr. Mercer asked. "From Elena's home office," Vanessa answered quickly. Too quickly. I found it in her estate binder. That was the first lie. I knew it instantly. I didn't keep my estate binder at home. I kept it in a locked fire safe in my office on the 23rd floor of Marlowe Biosystems, inside a walnut cabinet behind a fingerprint panel only 2 people could access. Me and my attorney. Not my mother. Not my sister. Certainly not Vanessa, who once needed me to reset the password on her own laptop 3 times in 1 month. Richard made a show of exhaling. "Doctor, with respect, Elena's been under extraordinary stress. The board sale, the surgery, everything with her father's estate. She said some disturbing things last week. About being tired. About wanting it all to stop. That was the second lie. She said she was tired of carrying all of you, I thought, but my jaw wouldn't open." Tessa's shoes squeaked lightly across the floor. "I'm not changing a code status based on a photocopy handed to me at 2 in the morning. Risk management would need." My mother cut in. "So you're going to ignore her wishes because you don't like my tone?" "No," Tessa replied evenly. "I'm going to follow protocol because I'm a nurse." That silence that followed was absolute. I could almost feel everyone's eyes shifting between them. Vanessa broke first. "This is insane. Elena made me her proxy." Third lie. I had removed Vanessa as my emergency contact 10 weeks earlier, after I found out she had used my name to authorize a discretionary transfer from the Leonard Marlowe Foundation into an event budget she was using to prop up her husband Grant's sinking consulting firm. The amount wasn't enormous. $48,000. Small enough to hide among gala invoices and donor hospitality. Big enough to tell me exactly what kind of woman my little sister had become when she believed I wasn't looking. Dr. Mercer said, "I don't see any proxy on file under your name." A rustle of paper. My mother's voice tightened. "Then your records are incomplete." No one answered her right away. Machines hummed. Air hissed softly through the vent above me. Somewhere down the corridor, a cartwheel rattled over a seam in the tile. Then Vanessa said the thing that changed everything. She won't remember any of this anyway. Not whispered. Not quite. More careless than quiet. Careless enough that everyone in the room heard it. I still couldn't move, but I remember thinking, very clearly, good, say more. The next sound I heard was a chair being pulled back. Dr. Mercer again. I want security to note this conversation. Now. Security. Richard barked. Over a family dispute. Tessa didn't wait for permission. I heard the soft click of a wall phone and her measured voice giving the unit number. The machinery in my body had started waking up before the rest of me did. My fingertips tingled. My tongue felt like sandpaper. A deep ache pulsed under my breastbone where they'd gone in to repair the valve defect that had nearly stopped my heart on the table. When I finally managed to crack my eyes open, the room came apart in strips of white light and blurred shapes. My mother was closest to the bed, one manicured hand resting on the rail as if she owned it. Her cream silk blouse was perfectly pressed. Her pearl earrings caught the fluorescent glare each time she turned her head. Vanessa stood just behind her in a slate-gray cashmere coat, phone in one hand, mouth pinched into that thin line she wore whenever she was about to claim innocence before anyone had accused her of anything. Richard had his palms spread in fake reasonableness. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of my bed with his jaw set. Tessa was already moving toward me. "Elena," she said softly. "Can you hear me?" I blinked once. My mother's hand tightened on the rail. "Sweetheart." I turned my eyes away from her. That was all it took to change the air in the room. "Elena," Vanessa said brightly, as if she hadn't just been negotiating my death in the same voice she used to order champagne. "There you are. We were so worried." My throat burned when I tried to speak. No sound came out except a scraped breath. Tessa bent close. "Don't force it. Squeeze my hand if you understand me." I did. She squeezed back. "Good." Dr. Mercer stepped forward. "Ms. Marlowe, your family says you have an advanced directive declining resuscitation after a second event. We need to verify your wishes. Can you nod for yes, shake for no?" My mother moved instantly. "Colin, she's disoriented." I kept my eyes on him and shook my head. Vanessa actually laughed. A short, brittle sound. "She's confused. She was sedated." I shook my head again, harder this time. Tessa's expression didn't change, but she picked up my chart. "That's clear enough for me." "What is wrong with you people?" Judith demanded. Her voice rose and sharpened. "She's barely conscious. You're inviting chaos." "No," I thought. "You brought it." When they lowered the breathing support and got me enough water to swallow, my voice came back in splinters. Pain makes the truth feel expensive. I paid for every word. "Phone," I whispered. Tessa leaned in. "Your phone isn't in the room." I dragged my gaze to Vanessa. Her pupils tightened. "Good again." "My purse," I said. "Not locker. Purse." A tiny beat passed. Tessa caught it. So did Dr. Mercer. Vanessa put on a frown she had practiced since adolescence, the one that said she was offended by the very idea of suspicion. "Elena, I secured your things for you." "No," I whispered. "You took them." Richard stepped in like a shield. "This is not the time." I looked at him until he shifted his weight. Then my mother tried a different tactic. She softened her face, lowered her lashes, let her voice turn honeyed. She had trained generations of donors and board members to trust that voice. "Elena, sweetheart, you're frightened. You heard fragments. Nobody is trying to hurt you." The fury I felt then was so cold it was almost clean. Not hot, not wild, clean like glass. "You said." I swallowed, tasting metal. "Don't revive me again." Judith's face barely changed. Vanessa's did. Just for a second. Just a flash. But I saw it. So did Tessa. My sister recovered fast. Because the doctors asked about prolonged resuscitation in the event of catastrophic complications. "You always said you didn't want machines. Elena, you know that." "I know," I said, each syllable scraped thin. "What you said after." Vanessa's hand tightened around her phone. Richard's gaze flicked to her. My mother's lips flattened. Dr. Mercer said quietly, "I think this conversation is over for now." "It is not over," Judith snapped. "This is my daughter." I found enough strength to turn my head and look directly at her for the first time. "No," I said. I'm your problem. Even drugged and half-broken, I watched that land. Security arrived a minute later. Not dramatic. Just 2 hospital officers in Navy uniforms with clipped movements and tired eyes, the kind of men who had seen every version of wealthy people believing rules were optional. Judith drew herself up. Vanessa began talking at once. Richard spread his hands again. It was almost funny how predictable they all were under pressure. My mother went imperial. My sister went injured. My stepfather went procedural. I lay still and listened while they all tried to reframe the scene before it hardened around them. She is delirious. She's been hostile for months. There's a board takeover hanging over her head. She's had pain medication. That nurse is escalating this unnecessarily. Tessa stood by my monitor with one hand lightly on the bedrail, saying almost nothing. That restraint impressed me more than outrage would have. Dr. Mercer requested an immediate hold on any code status changes pending legal verification. Security asked who had produced the directive. Vanessa said she had. Judith said it came from my office. Richard said Grant would verify everything once he arrived, which told me 2 useful things. First, my brother-in-law had been part of this from the beginning, and second, they hadn't expected me to wake up early enough to force improvisation. When Grant finally appeared, 20 minutes later, in a navy overcoat and rain on his shoulders, he took in the room with the quick, cold scan of a man calculating losses. He didn't rush to me. He went straight to Vanessa. "What happened?" he murmured. Her answer was almost inaudible. She heard. Grant turned to look at me then. Really look at me. His face remained controlled, but he blinked once, slowly, like a man realizing the building he set fire to had security cameras after all. "Elena," he said, moving closer to the bed. His voice was smooth, professional, almost compassionate. "Nobody is against you. Let's not turn a difficult medical night into a misunderstanding." There it was, the legal voice, the one he used when he wanted to smother a crime under vocabulary. I studied him. Grant Cross, 41, corporate restructuring specialist, expensive haircut, expensive watch, shoes polished hard enough to reflect the overhead light. He held his leather folio against his thigh with both hands now instead of one. Tight, defensive. "You forged it," I whispered. His brows rose by a fraction. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "You will." Vanessa made an impatient sound. "Oh my God. Elena, listen to yourself." I did. Carefully. I sounded weak. Ruined. Almost gone. Perfect. Because people like my family only relax when they believe they're stronger than you. I let them talk over one another for another minute. Let Judith demand a patient advocate. Let Richard complain about reputational damage. Let Vanessa cry without tears. Let Grant suggest private resolution. Then I lifted my hand. The movement was tiny, but it silenced the room. "Tessa," I said. "Yes. Please document, in my chart, that I revoke every emergency contact in this room." Vanessa's mouth dropped open. My mother said, "You cannot be serious." I didn't look at her. "And print," I said, forcing the next words out slowly so no one could claim confusion. "Every audit entry on my file from midnight until now." Grant's face changed before anyone else's did. That was when I knew. Because innocent people get offended. Guilty people start doing math. The next 2 days in the cardiac ICU were a study in controlled collapse. I slept in fragments. Woke in fragments. Pain came and went in measured tides. The room shifted from fluorescent midnight to gray dawn to the soft gold of late afternoon on the pale wood veneer cabinets and back again. But under all of it ran a single quiet current. Preparation. My family assumed I was too weak to move quickly. They were half right. I couldn't move quickly. I just didn't need to. By the afternoon after the code status incident, Priya Shah was in my room. She wore a charcoal suit with no visible label, carried a slim black folder, and moved with the unhurried precision of a surgeon who didn't need to announce competence because the room adjusted around it. Priya had been my attorney for 6 years, but more importantly, she was one of the few people in my life who had never mistaken my restraint for softness. She set her folder on the rolling table by my bed, glanced once at the closed door, then at me. "You look terrible." "I feel worse." "Good. You'll sound believable." Even then, with stitches in my chest and 4 in my arm, I smiled. Tessa was in the room checking medication. She gave Priya the kind of look women exchange when they're deciding in real time whether to trust one another with something expensive. Priya extended her hand. Tessa took it. Thank you, Priya said. Tessa replied, I just followed protocol. No, Priya said mildly. You followed your instincts before protocol caught up. Tessa accepted that without smiling. Another point in her favor. Once we were alone, Priya opened the folder and laid out the first sheet. My actual advance directive. Cream paper. Blue notary seal. Executed 3 months earlier at her office in Hudson Square. Full code status, unless 2 independent physicians certified irreversible terminal decline. Healthcare proxy. Priya Shah, not Vanessa. Secondary proxy. My longtime operations director, Naomi Valles. Family notification list restricted to written consent only. I let the sight of it settle over me. Not because I doubted it, because it mattered to see it there, solid and ordinary, after hearing my mother wave around the forged version in the dark. They submitted a photocopy at 2:11 a.m., Priya said. Risk management, pulled at the second Dr. Mercer escalated. It's not just false. It's sloppy. She slid over the photocopy. Even through the blur of pain medication, I saw it. My signature was wrong. Close enough for a stranger. Impossible for me to miss. The tail of the E in Elena curled too tightly. The slant on the M in Marlowe was lifted from an old board consent form I had signed on an angled conference table 5 years earlier after a red-eye flight from Zurich. I remember the pen. I remember the headache. That's how memory works when signatures are part of your life. They are muscle as much as ink. Priya tapped the page once. Guess where they got it? The decoy folder. She inclined her head. 2 months before surgery. After I confirmed Vanessa had been mining internal files for my signatures, I had created exactly what I wanted her to find. A folder in our family office cloud drive, labeled personal_directives_final. Inside it were scanned copies of old signatures, outdated drafts, and one pristine trap document containing a barely visible forensic marker embedded in the signature line. Not dramatic, not digital fireworks, just traceable image metadata that would identify when and where the file had been exported. I had not built the trap because I thought my family would try to let me die in a hospital bed. I had built it because by then I knew they were stealing around the edges of my life, and people who feel entitled to edges eventually reach for the center. I made sure they'd find exactly what I wanted them to find, I said. Priya's mouth lifted at one corner, and they used it from a desktop in Grant Cross's home office at 11:43 p.m. The export log is tied to his IP. That was Revelation 1. She handed me her tablet. On the screen was a chart audit report from St. Catherine's Medical Center, itemized by minute. Access to my electronic record at 12:17 a.m. by Nurse Tessa Ruiz for medication entry. At 1:54 a.m. by Dr. Mercer for post-op review. Then, at 2:06 a.m., an attempted attachment upload by a temporary admin credential from a terminal in the family consultation lounge. Failed. Retried. Succeeded at 2:11 a.m. How did they get an admin credential? I asked. Badged access piggybacking. Security footage is being preserved. That was Revelation 2. Priya then took my phone from her bag and placed it carefully in my hand. Vanessa hadn't secured it. She had only secured the wrong one. I kept 2 phones. Everyone knew about the silver one. Almost nobody knew about the black one, the one sitting now in my palm with a matte case and a hairline crack near the camera. I had handed it to Priya myself the day before surgery after scheduling a room audio backup app that activated whenever my room environment registered voices over a certain decibel threshold. I had done it because Vanessa had been circling me for weeks with a smile too polished to trust, and because the last text I'd seen flash across Grant's screen at a donor dinner, "Do we have the old signature set?" had landed in my stomach like a stone. I unlocked the phone slowly, deliberately. Pain makes your hands clumsy. I let that slowness work for me. People tell the truth around women they think are weakened. They tell the truth around patients even faster. The recording was there. Time-stamped. Backed up off device before dawn. My mother. We're not doing this again. Vanessa. Tomorrow morning at 9 the acquisition funds hit. If she's still alive, the voting shares stay locked with her. Richard. Let's keep this simple. Grant. Later, near the end. Then we need the chart updated before legal gets involved. I listened without expression. Priya watched me the way competent people do when they are measuring whether grief is about to interrupt strategy. It wasn't. That's 3 counts before lunch, I said quietly. Forgery, medical interference, attempted corporate fraud. Priya corrected me with professional calm. Conspiracy to commit, possibly attempted homicide depending on what the district attorney wants to do with the timing and the second statement. I rested the phone on the blanket. Actually, I said, more to myself than to her, they were committing fraud before they tried to kill me. Power settles, strangely, when you say the thing no one else in the room is brave enough to say out loud. It doesn't arrive loudly. It clicks into place. Priya slid one last paper across the tray table. A board notice. Special emergency meeting of Marlowe Biosystems. Postponed pending certification of CEO capacity and resolution of disputed control documents. Sent at 6:05 a.m. to every director, copy to outside counsel, hospital legal, and our acquiring company, Beacon Meridian. I looked up. I sent it before they could, Priya said. With a litigation hold. That was revelation 4. I let out one slow breath. My family had expected a silent bed, a forged directive, and enough confusion to blur whatever happened next. Instead, by sunrise, the hospital had audit logs, the board had a hold notice, outside counsel had been alerted, and every digital step they had taken was already being copied into evidence folders with their names on them. They thought I had no leverage in a hospital gown, I said. Priya closed the folder. They thought you were alone. That evening, Judith came back. Not with Vanessa this time. Alone. Which told me either she wanted to negotiate without witnesses, or she believed Mother still possessed a special right to rewrite reality in private. The room was dark except for the amber strip, light above the sink, and the softened blue glow from the monitor beside my bed. Outside the window, Manhattan was a scatter of wet glass and smeared red taillights in the rain. My pain had settled into a deep internal bruise. Tessa had lowered the room lights before leaving. Everything felt quieter, cleaner, easier to cut through. My mother stood by the visitor chair and removed her gloves one finger at a time. Priya Shah is making this ugly, she said. I almost laughed. No, I replied. My voice was stronger now. Still rough. You did. Judith set her gloves on the vinyl chair and folded her hands. Elena, families say terrible things in frightening situations. Vanessa was distraught. Vanessa was calculating. A flicker in her eyes. Then gone. Your sister has stood beside you your entire life. I turned my head on the pillow to look at her fully. My sister stood beside my bed and discussed share control while I was sedated. My mother exhaled through her nose. You always did reduce everything to documents and transactions when you wanted to avoid emotion. There it was. The family gospel. Whenever I named a fact, they called it cold. Whenever they performed cruelty, they called it concern. Let's talk about emotion then, I said. What did you feel when you handed a forged DNR to a doctor? She went still. If you are accusing me, I'm not accusing you. I looked at the ceiling for a second, then back at her. I'm documenting you. That landed harder. Judith pulled the visitor chair back but did not sit. You will destroy this family if you continue. No, I said. I will stop pretending one exists. For the first time in my life, I watched my mother lose the exact battle she had always won with me, the battle to make me explain my pain in a language that protected her. She tried once more, softer. Elena, your father would have hated this. My father, I said, would have hated what you became when he died. She left without another word. The next morning Vanessa tried a different script. She arrived in a camel coat and cream turtleneck, face scrubbed down to apparent vulnerability, a cup of expensive coffee in one hand and a set of tears she finally managed to produce in the other. The early sun came thin and winter pale through the hospital glass, picking out the gold flecks in the faux marble countertop and the tiny lines of fatigue under her eyes. She sat carefully, knees together, fingers wrapped around the paper cup like a woman preparing to film a confession. I know how this looks, she said. I let the silence do the work. She leaned forward. I said something horrible. I know, but I was scared. Scared of what? Her mouth trembled. The performance was almost competent. Of losing you. No, I said evenly. Try again. She stared at me. Scared of what, Vanessa? Her eyes hardened. There it was. That sudden drop, like lacquer cracking. Of losing everything, she said. Honesty, once dragged out, always comes stripped of glamour. I shifted slowly against the pillow. The incision in my chest protested. I welcomed the pain. It kept me precise. You already had your answer, I said. You just wanted the timing. Her nostrils flared. You were going to cut us off. I was going to stop funding your husband. Grant's business had a temporary cash flow issue. He built donor entertainment to a scholarship fund. You don't understand pressure. I almost smiled. You said that to the woman who built the company you're trying to inherit. She stood so abruptly the chair legs bit into the linoleum. You think you're better than everyone, she snapped. You always have. Dad treated you like the only adult in the room, and the rest of us just had to orbit you forever. There are moments when resentment becomes more useful than denial, because resentment tells the truth about motive. I nodded once. Thank you. She frowned. For what? For saying it plainly. I reached for my phone. Slowly. Watched her eyes track the movement. What are you doing? Saving time. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps. Elena, don't be insane. I unlocked the phone, tapped once, and turned the screen toward her. The transcription of the ICU recording stared back in black text on white. Her face drained so fast it looked like someone had pulled a shade down behind her skin. Then I tapped again. Grant's IP export log. Again. The chart audit. Again. A copy of the emergency board notice with Beacon Meridian copied in. Vanessa took 1 step backward and collided with the edge of the visitor chair. No, she said. I placed the phone on the blanket between us. Yes. You can't prove intent from that. I don't need to. I can prove access, forgery, attempted status change, and motive. Intent is just the part your lawyers will bill you most to explain. Her breathing changed. Shorter. Faster. You recorded me. I preserve myself. That's illegal. In New York, it isn't. She looked around the room as if exits might appear where walls were. I let the implications settle over her. When she spoke again, the aggression had curdled into panic. What do you want? That was the question. Not are you okay? Not how could this happen? Not what can I do? What do you want? I answered in the same tone I might have used to ask for water. I want every device you used preserved. I want every board communication untouched. I want Grant nowhere near my company. I want Mother away from this hospital. And I want you to understand something clearly. She swallowed. You were never deciding whether I lived. I held her gaze. You were deciding whether you could get away with my death. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the faint crackle in the fluorescent ballast over the door. Vanessa's lower lip trembled, not with sorrow, with rage held on a leash too short for the room. Then she said, You'll regret this. I almost admired the instinct. Cornered, and still reaching for threat. No, I said quietly. You will. She left without the coffee. That afternoon, after she was gone, Priya came back with a schedule. 48 hours, she said, setting the printed sheet on the tray. That's how long before we move from containment to demolition. I skimmed the headings. Hospital legal. Outside counsel. Forensic review. Special board session. Potential criminal referral. Trust restructuring. Restraining orders. You always did know how to cheer a patient up. I brought flowers in the form of subpoenas. She sat beside the window, crossed one leg over the other, and gave me the next piece of the story. Mara Bell had flipped. I hadn't expected that. Not because Mara lacked conscience. Because she had spent 8 years as Vanessa's executive assistant, and women in that role learned to survive by becoming fluent in what they must not see. Mara knew calendars, passwords, donor seating charts, private travel, discreet hotel bookings, emergency florist numbers, and which lies required hard copies. She had been Vanessa's shadow through every gala, every board retreat, every carefully lit family photo. If someone like that crossed the line, it was never for a small reason. What changed? I asked. Priya passed me her phone. On the screen was a forwarded email chain. From Vanessa to Mara, 11 days before my surgery, print the old directive draft with Elena's scan signature. Don't save locally. If anyone asks, you never saw it. Then, 6 minutes later, also keep your laptop logs clean. I am not protecting you if legal gets hysterical. I read it twice. Mara came to me yesterday morning, Priya said. Brought calendar entries. hotel invoices, printer records, and screenshots. Apparently, Vanessa had been using her to coordinate meetings with Grant and an outside physician named Ethan Weller. I knew the name. Concierge internist. Not on staff at St. Catherine's. Friend of Richard's from the East River Club. One of those expensive private doctors who marketed discretion like luxury skincare. Why did she switch? Priya's expression thinned. Because Vanessa was preparing to make her the scapegoat. That tracked. But also, Priya added, because Mara's brother died after a real directive was ignored during a trauma intake 9 years ago. She recognized exactly how dangerous this was. I rested my head back against the pillow. Some betrayals create their own witnesses. Priya stood, gathered the folder, and looked down at me. Rest tonight. Tomorrow you say very little unless I signal otherwise. They think they can still contain this. They think family shame will make you smaller than the evidence. I turned my face toward the window. Rain had stopped. The city beyond the glass looked scrubbed raw and silver. They had no idea, I said. I was willing to survive them. 3 days later I walked into Hamilton, Wren and Pike on VC Street, wearing a tailored black suit over a healing chest and enough concealed paint to qualify as architecture. The reception area smelled faintly of cedar and expensive coffee. Frosted glass divided the corridor into clean rectangles of privacy. A brushed steel sculpture turned slowly under recessed light. Everything about the place announced authority without noise. When the assistant led us into conference room C, the walnut table gleamed under low pendant lighting, and the leather chairs around it looked like they had been designed for people accustomed to saying no. Priya had insisted on the location for 2 reasons. First, it wasn't the hospital, which meant my mother couldn't perform maternal outrage in front of nurses. Second, the firm handled internal investigations for half the non-profit boards in Manhattan, which meant every face in that room would understand reputational blood loss when they saw it. I arrived with Priya, Naomi Voles, and a former federal prosecutor named Malcolm Sloan, who now specialized in complex white-collar exposure and had the calm, tired eyes of a man who had watched rich people discover consequences in real time for decades. Naomi, my operations director, was in navy with her dark hair pulled into a low knot, posture straight enough to shame a judge. She had run Marlowe Biosystems with me for 7 years and could read a spreadsheet the way other people read weather. More importantly, she was loyal without being sentimental. My family was already there. Judith sat at the far end of the table in dove-gray silk, but the effect was diminished now. Her shoulders were too high. Her handbag was clutched instead of placed. Richard stood beside the window with both hands in his pockets, rocking faintly on his heels as if impatience could disguise fear. Vanessa sat next to Grant, who had a legal pad in front of him and no jacket on, as though he intended to transform the room into an argument before anyone else could define it. 2 separate lawyers had joined them overnight. That told me the fractures had already started. Vanessa wouldn't look at me at first. That alone was worth the taxi ride. The room also held 3 people they had not expected to see. St. Catherine's general counsel, Eleanor Price, in deep green wool and rimless glasses. The hospital's chief compliance officer, Daniel Sue, with a tablet and a face like cut stone, and Mara Bell, seated along the side wall in a cream blouse and black slacks, hands folded in her lap so tightly I could see the tension in her knuckles from across the room. When Vanessa saw Mara, her head jerked up. What is she doing here? Mara met her gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked back at the table. Malcolm pulled out my chair. I sat. Slowly. My incision tugged. The leather was cool through my suit. No one spoke until Priya did. Thank you all for coming. Since there appears to be ongoing confusion about whether this is a family disagreement or a coordinated attempt to alter a patient's medical status and corporate control, we're going to proceed chronologically. I loved her a little in that moment. Grant leaned forward. Before we begin, I want to state for the record that my wife and her family deny any malicious intent and consider the use of covert recordings and selective digital evidence to be deeply misleading. Malcolm opened a thin folder. That's noted. It also doesn't matter. Grant's jaw shifted. Priya clicked a remote. The wall monitor lit up. Timeline, the heading read. Clean black letters on white. No drama. Just order. Order is terrifying to liars. 7 months ago, Priya began. Leonard Marlowe's estate entered final distribution. Under the controlling trust instruments, Elena Marlowe retained voting control of Marlowe Biosystems and sole approval over disposition in the event of acquisition. Judith Marlowe retained income benefits from the family trust, but not operational control. My mother's chin lifted. As my husband intended, Priya didn't even look at her. 4 months ago, Beacon Meridian issued a letter of intent to acquire Marlowe Biosystems. Estimated closing value, $28.4 million, Richard said, which was good news for everyone. No, Naomi said for the first time. Only if everyone stopped stealing. That landed so cleanly Richard actually blinked. Priya advanced the slide. 11 weeks ago, Elena Marlowe removed Vanessa Cross as an emergency contact and revoked prior access to medical directives after discovering unauthorized reimbursement activity tied to Grant Cross Advisory. Grant sat back. Unproven. Naomi slid a folder across the table. Page 14. He didn't touch it. 10 weeks ago, Priya continued, Elena executed a new advanced directive and healthcare proxy in my office, witnessed, notarized, and filed. Full code unless specific terminal criteria were met. Proxy assigned to me, with Naomi Velez secondary. Eleanor Price from Hospital Counsel placed a sealed copy on the table. We have verified the original, Vanessa's lawyer said. There may have been confusion over versions. Daniel Sue from Compliance looked up from his tablet. There was no confusion in the audit trail. Priya advanced the slide again. 11 days before surgery, Vanessa Cross instructed her assistant, Mara Bell, to print an outdated directive draft containing a scanned signature belonging to Elena Marlowe and to conceal local access logs. Vanessa's head snapped toward Mara. You told them that. Mara didn't answer. Instead, Priya held up a printed email with the sender line visible. I did, Mara said quietly. Vanessa actually laughed in disbelief. You worked for me. Mara turned then, finally, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not fear. Exhaustion burned down to truth. I did, she said, until you decided I was disposable. Vanessa opened her mouth. Closed it. Priya resumed. 9 days before surgery, Grant Cross exported a file labeled personal_directives_final from a cloud folder he had no authorized reason to access. Embedded metadata and network logs placed the export on a desktop registered to his home office. Grant's lawyer spoke fast. That proves access to a file, not use. Malcolm placed 3 enlarged still images on the table, the export log, the forged directive, and a forensic comparison of the embedded marker. It proves theft, manipulation, and attempted use, he said. You'll want to choose your wording more carefully. Grant looked at the images, and for the first time his composure cracked. Not loudly, just enough that he put both hands flat on the table as if steadying himself against motion. Priya advanced again. Night before surgery, Judith Marlowe, Richard Vale, Grant Cross, and Vanessa Cross met Dr. Ethan Weller at Parkline Grill at 8:12 p.m. My mother turned. We had dinner. Daniel Sue replied. You had dinner with a physician not credentialed on Ms. Marlowe's case who later attempted to contact post-op staff regarding long-term prognosis and code recommendations. We have the call log. Richard said, this is absurd. Malcolm said, no. It's documented. Priya moved to the next slide. At 2:06 a.m., attempted upload of forged directive from Consultation Lounge terminal. At 2:11 a.m., upload successful. At 2:14 a.m., audio capture begins. At 2:16 a.m., Judith Marlowe requests no further resuscitation. At 2:16 a.m. and 34 seconds, Vanessa Cross references acquisition funds and share control. At 2:18 a.m., Richard Vale instructs parties to keep this simple. At 2:24 a.m., Grant Cross states chart should be updated before legal becomes involved. The room seemed to constrict around the screen. Judith's fingers went to the base of her throat. Richard's foot began tapping against the carpet. Vanessa folded in on herself a fraction, elbows drawing close. Grant's face had gone the flat beige of paper. Then came the part one had been waiting for. The ally reveal. Priya turned from the screen and looked directly at Vanessa. You made one strategic error that undermined the rest of your planning. Vanessa's voice was tight. And what is that? You mistook dependency for loyalty. Priya gestured to Mara. Mara stood, smoothing her palms once over her skirt. Her voice trembled on the first sentence and then steadied. Vanessa asked me to print drafts from old archives. She told me Elena was emotional, that it was for emergency planning, that Grant would clean up the legal side. Then she told me if anything looked messy later, it would be smarter for me if my laptop history couldn't explain itself. No one interrupted her. I've worked for the Marlows since I was 26, she said. I booked flights, moved money between event budgets, handled donor communications, and ignored a lot I shouldn't have ignored because I needed the job. But the week before surgery, Vanessa forwarded me talking points about temporary incapacity at the company before Elena had even gone into the hospital. Then she asked me to prepare condolence contact lists. Naomi's head lifted. Mine didn't. I had expected it. You prepared what? Richard said. Mara turned toward him. Condolence contact lists. For board members. For donors. For the press. Vanessa stared at her in open fury. You are lying. Mara shook her head. I printed them. You marked preferred language in red pen. Priya slid copies across the table. Red circles. Vanessa's handwriting. I recognized the aggressive slant instantly. Grant swore under his breath. And then the room fractured exactly the way dishonest alliances always do once evidence removes the romance of conspiracy. Richard rounded on Grant first. You told us this couldn't be traced. Grant turned on Vanessa. You said the assistant was loyal. Judith hissed. This is because you couldn't keep your house in order. Vanessa shot back. My house. My house. You are the one who kept saying Elena wouldn't make it through surgery. Richard said, lower your voice. Grant stood up so fast his chair rolled back into the credenza. Do not put this on me. I never told anyone to let her die. Malcolm, still seated, said dryly. Helpful distinction. Grant whipped toward him. I want separate counsel. You already have it, Malcolm replied. Eleanor Price from the hospital folded her hands on the table. Before this gets any less productive, let me be clear about the institution's position. An unauthorized code status change was attempted using falsified documentation on a hospitalized patient. Relevant records have been preserved. Devices will be subject to subpoena. If any person in this room deletes anything, we will treat that as spoliation and escalate accordingly. Judith drew herself up. This can still be resolved privately. No, Priya said. It can't. Then she did something brilliant. She turned the screen off. Without the timeline glowing on the wall, everyone had to face one another instead of the evidence. The room became intimate again. Human, which is where guilt looks worst. Here are the options, Priya said. Option 1. We refer the complete file to the district attorney's office this afternoon. Notify Beacon Meridian that acquisition control was targeted through fraudulent medical interference. Initiate civil action against all involved parties. And petition for emergency injunctive relief freezing any trust-related discretionary distributions tied to Judith Marlowe and related entities. Option 2. You cooperate immediately. Vanessa's lawyer said, cooperate how? Malcolm opened another folder. By signing preservation orders. Immediate resignations from any formal or informal role related to Marlowe Biosystems or the Leonard Marlowe Foundation. Formal acknowledgement that the advance directive produced at St. Catherine's was unauthorized. Consent to forensic imaging of relevant devices. Non-interference commitments. And, in Judith Marlowe's case, waiver of any challenge to Elena Marlowe's restructuring of family trust distributions. My mother's eyes narrowed. You're blackmailing us. No, I said calmly. It was the first time I had spoken in nearly 20 minutes, and every head in the room turned toward me. I'm giving you the shortest road out of the fire you built. Grant looked at me with naked hatred now. Good. Hatred is honest. Hatred admits defeat faster than charm does. You planned this, he said. I met his gaze. I planned for you. Vanessa whispered. How long? I let a beat pass. Long enough. She shook her head. No, you didn't know we'd. I knew you were stealing from me. I knew Grant was raiding archives. I knew Mother was moving like somebody who thought she had more rights over my life than I did. I didn't know you'd choose a hospital bed as your stage. The leather in my chair creaked softly when I leaned back. I wanted you to see them, I said, and looked not at Vanessa but at Richard, then Judith, then Grant. I wanted each of you to see exactly who was sitting beside you when the mask slipped. No one moved. Then I looked at Grant and added, next time, Make sure the files you steal aren't marked. His face turned a shade darker. Vanessa's lawyer murmured something to her. She didn't seem to hear it. Judith tried one last appeal. Not to law. To myth. You would humiliate your own family in public. I folded my hands on the table. You tried to bury me in private. That was the end of negotiation. After that, the mechanics took over. Papers appeared. Separate lawyers huddled in corners. Malcolm and Priya moved item by item. Preservation consent. Signed. Interim resignation from foundation advisory roles. Signed. No contact restrictions except through counsel. Signed. Device surrender deadlines. Signed. Formal acknowledgement that no valid instruction to withhold resuscitation existed. Judith resisted that one longest. She held the pen above the page for nearly 30 seconds, eyes fixed on her own reflection in the dark window beside the credenza, as if she might locate the version of herself that could still dominate rooms by refusing to bend. Then Eleanor Price said, very mildly, Mrs. Marlowe, if you do not sign, we are prepared to release this directly to regulators and law enforcement before lunch. Judith signed. Vanessa followed, hands shaking hard enough to leave a jagged tail on the final S and cross. Grant signed with furious precision, pressing so deeply the imprint marked the next page beneath. Richard demanded to have under protest noted on his line. Malcolm wrote, client requested notation, no effect on enforceability, and slid the page back to him without expression. When it was done, Priya collected the documents into neat stacks, clipped them, and passed them off to associates waiting by the door. No one thanked anyone. I stood carefully. The room rose with me, almost out of instinct. Pain flashed white under my sternum and then receded. Judith looked older than she had a week earlier. Not softer, just older, as if the architecture of her certainty had finally lost load-bearing support. Vanessa wouldn't meet my eyes. Grant did, but only because anger was all he had left that still felt like power. Richard had begun scrolling through his phone with the frantic thumb of a man already seeking a newer, smaller version of the story. I picked up my coat. Vanessa said my name. Quietly, almost like the little sister she used to be before envy polished itself into ambition. I turned. Her mascara had smudged under one eye. Her mouth moved once before any sound came out. I didn't think. She started, then stopped. No, I said. You didn't. I left them there under the low warm lights, surrounded by walnut, leather, and signatures, and as the elevator doors closed on the reflection of all four of them shrinking behind me, I realized something simple and final. They had spent years teaching me that survival meant endurance. They were wrong. Sometimes survival means documentation. 6 months later, the first thing I noticed most mornings was light. Not hospital light, not conference room light, real light. Sunlight warming the pale oak floors of my apartment in Tribeca, sliding across the steel frame of the balcony doors, turning the surface of my coffee into a dark amber mirror. My new place wasn't enormous by Manhattan standards, but it felt honest in a way the family townhouse never had. Concrete softened by linen curtains. Bookshelves I had chosen myself. A kitchen with matte stone counters. And no inherited silver no one was allowed to actually use. On clear mornings I could stand barefoot at the window with a ceramic mug in both hands and watch the city wake in bands of gold and glass. Healing is less dramatic than people think. It isn't one moment. It's repetition without fear. By then the stitches were gone. The scar on my chest had flattened from angry red to a thin pale seam. My heart, repaired by strangers who had done their jobs while my family tried to interfere with it, beat steadily beneath silk sleep shirts and tailored jackets and the ordinary, radical boredom of mornings I owned. The consequences came in waves. Grant fell first. The Bar Association opened an inquiry after the forensic trail from his home office, his attempted draft board resolutions, and the archive access logs became impossible to explain as spousal confusion. Beacon Meridian withdrew any provisional advisory relationship with him. 2 clients quietly terminated contracts within 3 weeks. By the time the disciplinary hearing ended, his law license wasn't permanently gone, but it was suspended pending further review, and in his world, suspension was just public disgrace with paperwork. The last I heard, he was doing strategic compliance consulting out of a sublet office near White Plains for companies too small to Google thoroughly. Vanessa tried to hold her social position longer than her professional one. That was always her true talent. Not building value, curating appearances. She resigned from the foundation before the board could remove her, issued a statement about health-related family misunderstandings, and spent 3 disastrous weeks trying to frame herself as collateral damage in a story about grief, female leadership, and sibling complexity. It might even have worked if she hadn't underestimated how vicious, wealthy nonprofit circles become when medical ethics and inheritance fraud enter the room at the same time. Invitations dried up. The women who had once air-kissed her at the Conservancy dinner began saying, "You know, I just don't know what to believe," which in our world means they believe the worst and are enjoying it. More materially, Vanessa lost what she had really been reaching for. The trust distribution challenge she had hoped Judith would mount never happened because Judith had waived it in that conference room. My restructuring went through. Family allowances tied to discretionary operating revenue ended. Foundation expense authority was split among external trustees. Vanessa's access vanished all at once, like a stage light cutting to black. Last I heard from Mara, she was doing contract event work for a hospitality group in Miami under her maiden name, introducing herself to new people as if geography had cleansing properties. Judith's punishment was different because her crime had always depended on status more than salary. Nobody arrested her. That disappointed people who confuse handcuffs with justice. What happened instead was slower and, for her, far worse. 3 boards asked for her quiet resignation. The East River Club did not renew her committee role. 2 women who had copied her floral choices for 15 years suddenly stopped returning calls. A fundraiser she had chaired for a decade rebranded without her name anywhere on the invitation. In public she held posture, pearls, and tone. But according to Naomi, who still heard things through trusty channels, Judith had begun arriving early to events just to avoid walking into rooms where conversations paused when she entered. There are women for whom exclusion is a physical pain. My mother was one of them. Richard tried to preserve himself through bluster and distance. He told people he had only been present out of concern, that he was dragged in, that this was all a hysterical overreaction by lawyers looking for leverage. Unfortunately for Richard, men who survive on swagger often forget how badly they sound when forced into transcripts. His "let's keep this simple" line traveled farther than he did. He lost a board seat at a private investment group and spent the next few months pretending it was a voluntary strategic rotation. It would have been almost touching if he hadn't once stood beside my bed hoping simplicity meant my death. Dr. Ethan Weller received a formal complaint, lost 2 hospital consulting arrangements, and discovered that rich people adore discretion right up until discretion becomes risk. He never contacted my family again as far as I know. I archived them all. Not deleted. Archived. There is a difference. Deletion is emotional. Archiving is administrative. The only message that made me pause came from Richard, of all people, 6 weeks after the settlement conference. I should have stopped it. No explanation. No plea. No excuse. Just that one sentence. I archived that too. What I did respond to were opportunities. During recovery, while Priya and Malcolm handled the legal perimeter and Naomi stabilized the company through the acquisition close, I found myself fielding calls from people I had never met. A hospital foundation director in Connecticut whose brother had been pressured into changing care directives under family influence. A widow in New Jersey whose husband's estranged son appeared during hospice intake with suspicious paperwork. A biotech founder in Boston who wanted to understand how to secure executive incapacity, planning against internal manipulation. At first I answered because I knew what it felt like to have your reality challenged while your body was weak. Then I answered because I was good at it. By the end of that autumn, I had stepped back from day-to-day operations at Marlowe Biosystems, by choice, not by force, and launched Second Voice Advisory, a practice dedicated to medical autonomy protection, executive incapacity planning, and high-conflict directive verification. We worked with hospitals, family offices, private counsel, and women whose wealth had suddenly made their bodies look negotiable to the wrong people. Naomi came on as strategic lead 2 days a week. Priya referred half my earliest clients, and Mara Bell, in a twist that would have made Vanessa physically ill, became my director of operations. The first time Mara walked into our office, a renovated loft on Franklin Street with black-framed glass partitions, warm white pendant lights, and a long reclaimed oak table scarred beautifully with old grain lines, She stood in the doorway like someone waiting to be told she'd mistaken the address. "You really want me here?" she asked. I handed her a key card. "You know where people hide things," I said. "That's a marketable skill." Her laugh came out startled and shaky and real. It was the first time I saw the woman beneath the posture she'd worn for Vanessa. We built the firm the way I had rebuilt myself, methodically. Secure intake systems, directive authentication protocols, emergency access ladders, board incapacity firewalls, quiet training sessions for hospital administrators under brass light fixtures and projector glow. Checklists that looked simple until you realized how many lives depend on simple things being impossible to tamper with. I spent mornings drafting policy templates over coffee and afternoons sitting across from clients at our oak table while late sun moved in clean rectangles over legal pads and laptops. The work had the peculiar satisfaction of usefulness. No legacy theater. No family mythology. Just practical defense against the oldest human temptation there is. Deciding someone else's vulnerability entitles you to power. One Friday in November, Mara came into my office carrying 2 cappuccinos and gossip. My office had a glass wall on one side overlooking the main workspace, linen-textured wallpaper behind the shelves, and a bronze desk lamp that cast a low-honeyed pool over whatever file I was reading. Outside, the city had turned cold enough that everyone on the street moved faster. Inside, the radiator hissed softly beneath the window. Mara set a cup down in front of me. "You won't believe who Olivia Spencer saw at Cipriani." I took the coffee. "If this is about Vanessa, I need stronger foam." "It is about Vanessa." Mara sat in the chair across from me and tucked one leg under the other. She had started doing that only recently, a small sign of comfort. Apparently, she spent 20 minutes pretending not to notice 3 former donors from the foundation while pitching destination branding packages to a hotel group that definitely knew who she was. I raised an eyebrow. Mara grinned. And when one of them asked how Judith was doing, Vanessa said, "We're all healing privately," which is apparently wealthy person code for total social extinction. I laughed. A real laugh. Not because her humiliation delighted me, although irony has always had its place, but because 6 months earlier I had been lying under fluorescent light, listening to that same woman discuss my heartbeat like an inconvenience. Mara wrapped her hands around her cup. "For what it's worth, she looks tired. So do I.